And Word on Fire, your own ministry, being so influential in the YouTube world and the podcast world and elsewhere, is there something happening in the culture, I suppose?
There was a hand-wringing quality to the Catholicism of my youth, and I think we're finding our footing again.
I'd be interested what you're seeing on the ground.
Just roaming around the expo center here, I think 15 different people all over the world said to me, I became a Catholic and Word on Fire had a lot to do with it.
Wow.
Very interested engagement in the digital world. A lot of young people, especially young men, have gotten reinterested in religion. Now, my goal is to bring them from there now into the space of the church, into the liturgy and the Eucharist.
Putting things in containers and traditions that actually increase the attractiveness.
The more we emphasize, as you say, the weirdness of Christianity in its doctrinal claims, in its manner of presenting itself to the world, it'll be more compelling, not less. Let the Bible be the Bible. I want to make this thing strange, hard to believe. A carpenter rose from the dead, but that's my message. Or it's not just another myth.
There is, I would argue, this meaning crisis in the culture, people looking for a better story, people opening up to the possibility of the supernatural. How does the church reap the harvest that is evidently there? Bishop Robert Barron, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Delighted to talk to you.
We're here at the Ark Conference. What is Ark, as far as you can see, and what brings you as a speaker?
I've been here now. This is my second year. I was here for the first one, a little over a year ago. My sense of Ark is it's trying to recover the best of Western civilization and revive it according to its own best values. That's how I read it. Jordan Peterson and I have had a friendship for a while, and I kind of know where his mind is at in regard to these more civilizational issues. So I was happy to contribute to it. Last year I was here for the inaugural one, and this one's bigger. I think they have twice as many or three times as many people. So it's impressive. It's an impressive gathering of people too. Just moving around the kind of expo room there, I met the whole world. So I think it's really a healthy thing.
Yeah, a lot of Christians all under one roof, but alongside an interesting mix of a lot of secular folk, sort of conservative thinkers, influencers, and so on. I mean, do you sense that this thing that Ark says it's about, renewing the foundations of Western civilization, and especially the Christian story, is that something you're encountering more widely?
Yep. Yeah, I am, because I think what's happened is in our very postmodern culture where everything is all over the place, I'm drawing from this and that, I'm questioning everything, people are looking for a foundation. And so you can't really soar unless you take off from some foundation. Or to shift the metaphor, it's like Newman's metaphor, is the river gets energy from the banks. If you knock the banks of a river, it just spreads out into a lazy lake. But it's got strong banks, then boom, the river can move. And that's the paradox, is the more you emphasize the foundational values, the more dynamic a society becomes. To me, the postmodern thing produces a lot of cultural boredom because, all right, is that true? I don't know. Is that true? Maybe for you, but not for me. And can we find common ground? Well, don't do that. Don't impose your view on me. You got your truth, I got my truth. To me, that's a formula for cultural despair and a kind of laziness of the spirit. What I talked about today was this, the soul is meant to soar outward and upward, but it does so according to a lure, from a transcendent cause. I think all of that is operative today in people's desire to find the riverbanks again, to find the foundation. And they've been kind of floating on this lazy lake of postmodern skepticism and indifferentism and relativism. I won't bother you. You're floating on the lake over there. I'll float over here on my terms. But what a dull society that is. What an energy-less society that becomes. To me, at its best, that's what a conference like this is about.
And Word on Fire, your own ministry, which has just had this fantastic rise to, being so influential in the YouTube world, in the podcast world and elsewhere. And so many, as far as I can see, secular people starting to reconsider Christianity because of your ministry. Is there something happening in the culture, I suppose, where people are looking for something more solid, a foundation, and I guess you're speaking into that?
Yes, they're looking for it. And I'll do the other side of it. The church has not been very good at providing it. So the church I came of age in, so right after Vatican II, I go to first grade in 1965, the year the council ends. So my whole formation, even in the seminary, was very post-conciliar. And it participated to some degree in that cultural drift I was just talking about. A certain lack of confidence, a lack of evangelical boldness, don't be imposing things, And then that tendency typical of liberalism to reduce the supernatural to the natural. So religion becomes, in my time, psychology was extremely important. A lot of priests became psychologists. Sermons became psychological in focus. And the other great option, of course, is politics. So reduce the supernatural to the political. Does the supernatural indeed have political and psychological implications? Of course, but you don't naturalize the supernatural. You should supernaturalize the natural. Now, that's the way I would name it. When I was coming of age, it was very much the liberal model. And I think that ran out of steam for a lot of people. And the church became rather inept, I think, at proposing its own message. So I think Word on Fire maybe is making its own small contribution to that, is the church finding its voice again. There was a hand-wringing quality to the Catholicism of my youth. Who are we to be telling you, oh, well, very apologetic, in the negative sense of apologetic. And I think we're finding our footing again and finding our voice
It
again.
feels like that. It feels like there's a sort of confidence that's come back. Hopefully not a kind of hubris or anything like that, but something which says, actually, no, we've got a message and people are kind of ready to hear it again.
And, I'll get a little too academic here, but the source of a lot of the mischief is Friedrich Schleiermacher.
Okay.
The founder
But for those who don't know, give us a quick
the
primer.
founder of modern liberal Protestantism, who writes a famous book, 1799, called On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. And it's a great book in the history of theology, indeed, but it set the tone for much of liberalism, both Protestant and Catholic. What's our job? Well, we've got cultured despisers out there, people that don't like us, and they don't like our message. So I got to find a way to get them to like me. That's the wrong instinct, it seems to me. I don't think St. Paul was giving speeches to the cultured despisers. Paul was announcing Jesus Christ in a culturally engaged way, to be sure. So it's not an either or. But the Schleiermacher move was more I come hat in hand to the secular culture and begging them to pay attention to me. No, Paul came into town with a message, anastasis, resurrection, Jesus rose from the dead. And so there was a kind of pandering quality to too much of Catholic life. And I think we're overcoming that. I think John Paul II, as I was coming of age then, represented an alternative. I think he showed how you can evangelize in a very bold, very confident, and non-violent, non-threatening way. And someone, talk about plugged into the culture, John Paul II. So he knew how to engage the culture, but not in the Schleiermacher mode of giving speeches, hoping they'll take it seriously, but a confident proclamation.
And that Schleiermacher mode arguably was about trying to sort of make Christianity and its supernatural claims a bit more palatable to a sort of rational Western culture. I feel almost like the reverse is now becoming true, that people need the weirdness, the strangeness of Christianity. That's actually part of its attraction.
Absolutely. And go right back, again, take Schleiermacher at the beginning of the 19th century, then about the middle of the 19th century of Kierkegaard, who says, my job as a theologian is to make Christianity hard to believe. And see, it was a typical Kierkegaard sort of move, but is to say, well, look, if it's easy to believe, it's not worth believing. Then I'm just echoing the secular culture. I'm saying what any psychologist or political activist or Oprah could say, right? But I want to make this thing strange, hard to believe. A carpenter rose from the dead, but that's my message, And that has always been worth proclaiming because it's strange. Now, it doesn't mean the resurrection is an irrational message. It's not. Read N.T. Wright's 800-page book on the resurrection, to see a rational account of it if you want. But it does mean you lead with what's distinctive and boldly so about Christianity.
So I wrote a book, and you very kindly did a few episodes of your podcast looking at some of the chapters in it, called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And one of the things you touched on was the rise and fall of new atheism. And my contention, my thesis has been that as much as it came in a blaze of glory, it's sort of very much waned now, that very rationalistic, scientific way of approaching things. People are looking for enchantment again, and the new atheists sort of failed to deliver that. To what extent do you feel, in that sense, we're in a to what extent should we be marshalling those kind of rationalistic apologetic arguments versus kind of, I don't know, giving people a story that kind of enchants them?
Well, see, I'm an always all of the above kind of guy, because I think it depends on whom you're talking to and what's on their mind. When I was teaching in the seminary, I'd say you got to go out with like a physician with his bag, and there's all kinds of different medicines and treatments in there, because it depends. Some people, like when I was a young guy, I'm 13 years old or 14 years old, and ran across the Aquinas arguments for God's existence. Changed my whole life. I was a Catholic going to Mass on Sunday, but I never thought about religion deeply at all. And then Aquinas came in, and so it appealed through my mind in a big way. Well, not everyone's like me, I get that, but that worked for me. So apologetics, yes, can play an important role. I was talking to William Lane Craig this many years ago, and we both said the same thing. He said when he was a young man, it was arguments for God's existence that really, and of course he famously articulates the Kalam argument, to this day. But we both said, everyone's always told us, oh no, that's not the way to do it. Don't use, well, in our case, it worked, Now, having said that, there are a lot of other approaches. I'm a Newman man. Your countryman, John Henry Newman, I'm with him. I mean, it's the illative sense. I mean, how do you come to say, yeah, that's true? Well, argument has something to do with it, but it's often, it's hunch, intuition, it's relationships, it's what other people believe in people that you admire. There's all kinds of reasons why you say, yes, I believe this. So I think the canny evangelist has got to be like a tennis player who's ready to move in any direction. Where's the ball going to go? I don't know. It could be a drop shot. It could be, I got to be able to move with my interlocutor.
One of the things that I sense, though, in all of this is that whether people are ready to hear those kinds of arguments depends on the kind of cultural milieu and context. And the new atheism made it very difficult for people to even consider it because it was just unfashionable, frankly. I think because we've moved into quite a different mode, it's creating a possibility for those more traditional apologetic arguments to be heard by people who might respond to them. And one thing that's interesting, just before you were sitting in that chair, I've been having a couple of conversations here at Ark with two people who are still agnostic/atheists, but have moved a long way from the kind of new atheist sort of mode they were once in. Carl Benjamin and James Lindsay were the two people I've been speaking to. And both of them said very similar things. They said, I now think about the Bible completely differently to the way I used to. I don't, at this point, accept its sort of supernatural claims, but I think it's the most profound document that's ever been produced. What's going on, in your view, in a culture where suddenly people are having this sort of paradigm shift? Maybe they're not gone all the way, but they're talking about scripture completely differently.
I'll give Jordan Peterson a lot of credit. Jordan was here at the Ark Conference, and the fact that he began talking about the Bible and uncovering, he's a Jungian, so he looks at archetypal patterns of meaning and the psychological dimension. But he opened up the Bible and convinced people that you don't have to get stuck in this sort of fundamentalist debate about, literalism versus, complete inerrancy. And see, in my country anyway, a lot of that was conditioned by the Scopes trial, 1925. I don't know how much impact that had here, but in America, that set the tone for so much of the heroic rationalist who's moving beyond these naive, literal. And then
there was a film adaptation.
Right, it was Inherit the Wind, and then the Yahoo fundamentalists who are clinging to their literalism. And of course, anyone that knows anything about Bible interpretation knows. Go back to Origen of Alexandria, early 3rd century, who's giving you richly non-literalistic, symbolic, archetypal readings of the Bible. St. Augustine does it massively. Carl Jung, who's Jordan Peterson's great hero, said the first great psychologists were the church fathers. So my point is, the church has long known how to read the Bible in a very sophisticated way. Look at the 4 senses of the scripture going back to ancient times. So this view that either you're a Yahoo fundamentalist literalist or you're a complete, debunking rationalist, a plague on both your houses. The church has always had a very subtle manner of reading the Bible. I think it's been rediscovered. And I do give Jordan a lot of credit because in a way, and I've told him this, in a way he sort of stumbled onto it because he started, I look at these texts, these are extraordinarily rich. And I don't mean that in any demeaning way to him, but Augustine knew about that, and Origen knew about that, and Chrysostom knew about that, Thomas Aquinas knew about it. I think that strain is being rediscovered, thank God.
Hi there, I hope you're enjoying the show. If you'd like a free chapter from my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and also from my latest book, Why I'm Still a Christian, then subscribe to my newsletter and I'll send you those chapters along with updates on my work. I won't spam you, just encourage you with Thinking Faith articles, events, videos and resources. The newsletter link is with the info. Enjoy the rest of the show. And I've also appreciated that journey. It feels like a lot of people are kind of with him as he works it out himself almost. Right. I don't know exactly where he stands, and lots of people, debate, did he just admit that Jesus is the Son of God? I mean, how important is it that there is a sort of line that people cross from it being kind of incredibly helpful, symbolic, deep, psychologically interesting to some kind of an objective truth claim about Jesus and God?
Yeah. One time in conversation with Jordan, I said, the moment when the archetype meets history, when the two meet. So like even Immanuel Kant can say, oh yeah, Jesus, he's the archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God. That's how he read the New Testament. So yeah, this great archetypal figure is presented in a literary form. And we say, well, isn't that fascinating? But see, what happens when the Word became flesh? The archetype met history, and the archetype became a reality. And that's the next step. But as an opening of the door, I'm okay with, uncover all this sort of rich stuff. And there are these senses, what we call maybe the psychological sense. The fathers would have called the tropological sense, the moral sense of the scripture. Fine. If that's the way in, terrific. But yeah, the scripture keeps leading you deeper and deeper.
And it almost mirrors somewhat C.S. Lewis's journey there, doesn't it? When he had that famous walk with J.R.R. Tolkien, and Lewis had become convinced that probably there is a God, but he still struggled with this idea that is Jesus just one more mythology among others, and Tolkien sort of persuaded him, well, what if myth became fact in a person, and it sort of both explains what came before and what comes after.
Isn't it wonderful that one of the great myth makers of the 20th century, Tolkien's one that convinced him because he knew the difference. It's like the famous Flannery O'Connor, when someone said, well, the Eucharist is a powerful symbol. And she said, well, if it's a symbol, to hell with it. And that's from someone who knew how to use symbols very powerfully indeed. So don't tell Flannery O'Connor, oh, you don't really appreciate what symbolism means. No, she's one of the great symbolic writers of the 20th century. And yet she could say, if the Eucharist is only that, to hell with it. Well, Tolkien is similar, isn't it? He knew all about myths, but this story is the myth became a reality, or it's not just another myth. That's an important moment.
And I think it for me, it's as though it's wonderful to see metaphor and to see imagery and symbolism. But is it metaphor and symbolism all the way down? It feels like there has to be a sort of foundation. And for me, if it's in the end, if what you're saying is, well, it's all really based on material, matter, biological, undirected processes, it feels like it's just a giant accident in the end. I much prefer, and I think other people I sense are moving in the direction of, there's got to be something, the one behind all this mythology and purpose and meaning and so on.
Yeah, the good dreams of the human race, isn't that Lewis's thing, But yeah, behind the sciences, what do you find? But behind all this radical intelligibility, see, I've been in these conversations many times with atheist, agnostic scientists, and we'll always reach that point. I'll say, okay, that's great, everything you've said, but where does the intelligibility come from? Why should it be so radically and in such a complex way intelligible? And I find they always give some version of, you can't ask that question, or I don't know, or that's just the way it is. And I'm like, so I'm the advocate of some irrational system, but I think that's the most interesting, rational question to ask. Is why should the universe be so rational?
Moving from these intellectual heights to the sort of what's happening on the ground in local parishes. I was fascinated to see, for instance, in 2024, at the Easter Vigil in France, the Catholic Church saw its largest intake of adult converts essentially in living memory. I'm hearing similar stories elsewhere. I'd be interested what you're seeing on the ground and whether all of these anecdotal data points about a lot of people suddenly seeming to take an interest and turning up in church, whether that's reflected in your experience.
Yeah, it is for sure. Now, there's like the ultimate goal for a Catholic of evangelization is to bring people to Mass. That's the goal. I think maybe we're not there yet. Where we are is a lot of very interested engagement in the digital world. And the church, I think, Word on Fire is an example of it, has found a way to invade that space and to become a presence within it. And I think there indeed, and I'll bring in Peterson and everybody else, a lot of young people, especially young men, have gotten reinterested in religion. I think there it's very much alive. Now, my goal is to bring them from there now into the space of the church, into the liturgy and the Eucharist. But okay, patiently in God's time, just roaming around the expo center here, just for, 45 minutes, I think 15 different people all over the world said to me, I became a Catholic and Word on Fire had a lot to do with it. It's like, okay, that's why we do it. But see, we first had to engage them in the internet space, and that then brought them. When I was at the Youth Synod, so now we've had the Synod on Synodality, right? But prior to that, I was elected delegate to the Synod on Young People. And for weeks, we talked, in the presence of the Pope, all these bishops, about young people, how do we get them more engaged? And almost everybody talked about parish programs and diocesan programs and how do we get, and I stood at one point and said, brothers, this is not working. They're not going to come to our churches. We have to go out and get them in their space, Duc and Ultum, and I'll make you fishers of men and all that. Go out in their space, and then we can reel them in, But that's been happening, no question about it. And it is reflected in the stats. The stats are improving. We seem to have stopped the slide. We were talking a lot about disaffiliation, just sliding. That seems to have stopped anyway, in some cases reversing. But that's the work of the present moment.
And what's interesting to me is that what arguably failed to work in some versions of Catholicism that you were raised in, which perhaps tried to appeal by kind of becoming more like the everyday person, it's actually the quite traditional forms of Catholicism that seem to be attracting young people against all our expectations. What's going on there? What's the appeal there?
Well, I'll go back to my own time. You're right. I mean, when I was coming of age, it was, guitars and tambourines, and let's sing, 3-chord folk songs. And because we want to be relevant, we want the kids to like us. But the trouble with that was it was just a very, very faint echo of the entertainment culture of the time. And so people said, well, heck, I get much better entertainment on television or somewhere else. Where the church being itself, speaking a message that can't be heard anywhere else. So that's the pulpit question. Is the pulpit just a place where I'm hearing an echo of the secular culture, political or otherwise? And then there's the whole liturgical, doctrinal. Are we saying something and exhibiting something that you cannot find in the ordinary cultural space? That will be interesting to people. And that's what's happening, I think, is the more we emphasize, as you say, the weirdness of Christianity in its doctrinal claims, in its manner of presenting itself to the world, it'll be more compelling, not less. But believe me, everybody, we all ran off that cliff, the Schleiermacher cliff of let's give speeches to our culture despisers. Let's make ourselves appealing on their own terms, to young people. I go back to my nephew, a brilliant guy. He went to MIT. Now he's working at SpaceX, sending rockets to Mars. But when he was a little kid, he went through religious education. And most of his teachers were very much in the Schleiermacher mode. He had one teacher in one of his grades who was tough, taught them the Bible in its peculiarity and distinctiveness, insisted they learn. Well, of course, that's the only teacher he remembers. Of course, that's the only one that had an impact on him. So I think we have to resist the Schleiermacher intuition, but man, it was deep in the Catholic psyche.
And when you see these, especially these young men, against all expectations, embrace, what are they coming for? What is it that they haven't found in the culture, which suddenly they discover to their surprise is there in the liturgy, the tradition, the worship, and the community of
the supernatural? I would say they're finding the supernatural. They're finding something other. God's described as totalitarian, totally other. They're finding the sacred. They're finding the mysterium tremendum et fascinans. I mean, they're finding the heart of religion. But it's the naturalizing of all that led to the disaffiliation. I think that boredom, that leads to a bored religion, tired religion. They want the supernatural because they were built for the supernatural. That's the weird paradox at the heart of Christian anthropology is by nature, we're ordered to the supernature. By nature, we're ordered to something that we can't acquire on our own. So it's the breakthrough of the unconditioned, the breakthrough of the sacred, God speaking. Those are all just metaphors for the same thing, right? But that's what they want and what they're seeking because they can't find that in the secular culture. And see, we have ways in our genius of signaling that. And that's where vestments and incense and song and chant, and that's where all that comes in. It's meant to awaken that supernatural sensibility. But see, again, when I was coming of age, all that was de-emphasized on purpose. Don't have weird chanting hymns. Have, 3-chord folk songs. Don't have fancy vestments. Make them as kind of like burlap as possible. Don't have a distinctive liturgy. Make it more like a, jamboree. All bad instincts, seems to me. And so what young people are finding is when we do the opposite, it's attractive to them.
Yes. It's one of those strange things, isn't it, where we often think if we just make things kind of more free, people will kind of gel more with it. But actually, sometimes it's putting things in containers and traditions that actually increase the attractiveness of these things.
The great image there is your other countryman, Chesterton, right? He has that image of kids playing at the edge of a cliff, but with a high, thick wall. They'll have a ball. They'll play soccer, everything. Someone goes, tear down that wall. Well, I don't want to be constrained. Tear down the wall. And now they just cower because the cliff edge is right there. So, right, it's the walls, it's the banks of the river that actually give us energy and give us enthusiasm.
Yeah. Given that the church maybe did take a wrong turn in trying to accommodate secular culture and so on, what's your advice now to the church? If there is, I would argue this meaning crisis in the culture, people looking for a better story, people opening up to the possibility of the supernatural, how does the church reap the harvest that is evidently there?
Keep preaching the Bible on its own terms. There I'm with Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian, that he didn't want to translate the Bible into some other language. Let the Bible be the Bible. It's a thicket it's like a jungle, the Bible. It's weird and wonderful and mysterious and dangerous. Fine, in we go. Go into that, guide people through it. Don't try to translate all that into something more accessible. So in our preaching, be bold and be deeply biblical. Fulton Sheen said that, the great American, preacher, his first rule of preaching, it seems too obvious even to state, but he said, be biblical. But see, in my time, priests, we were kind of discouraged from being biblical. Take a couple ideas from the Bible and then talk about your vacation or talk about something that will be relevant to people. No. Get them into the thick jungle of the Bible and its characters and strangeness and, So I'd say that. And then liturgically, let it be strange and colorful and evocative of a higher world. Speak our moral teaching boldly because it shouldn't just be utterly congruent with the latest psychological intuitions. Okay? What'll make me happy? Well, the psychologists say this. Yeah, but God has said that. Stay with that. Now, there'll be overlap, to be sure. There will be. But don't psychologize our moral teaching. Let it be true on its own terms. So I would say all of that is key to, as you say, reaping the harvest.
Now, you are leaning into that with your ministry within the wider Catholic Church. Do you sense that that's where the energy is? There are obviously people with different visions for where they would like the Catholic Church to go. There will be, at some point, a question mark over who is the leader of the Catholic Church as a whole. What are your hopes, your fears, and where would you like to see the energy?
I think the church that we've been talking about, so let's say we got the Schleiermacher approach, then the anti-Schleiermacher. To my mind and in my experience, the anti-Schleiermacherians are the more lively part of the church. If you want to see where the church is really cooking, it's in that Newman rather than Schleiermacher. Let's say Chesterton rather than Schleiermacher. I think that's where you find the life. And that's what I would do. I would say, look, where's the life? Now let's follow that. Go with that path.
Well, thank you for all you're doing in literally setting things on fire. Well, not literally, but metaphorically setting things on fire, putting the word on fire. I'm excited to be joining you for a conversation with N.T. Wright.
Yeah,
soon
I'm
as
looking
well,
forward to that a
which
lot.
we'll put out as well on this channel. But thank you for all you're doing. I know many more people who you have significantly influenced, whether they've ended up in the Catholic stream or not, people for whom you helped them to take Christianity seriously. So,
Well, thanks, Justin. A delight to be with you today.
Thank you for watching. For more Thinking Faith, do subscribe to my newsletter. And if you want to support my work, you'll get early access episodes and bonus content. Gold supporters even get free signed copies of both my books too, and the chance for a regular catch-up with me. Again, the links are with the show info. See you next time.